If you're looking for new ways to meet the needs of all the students in your class, you are in the right place. I'm going to be sharing 6 ways to differentiate by content in this video. My name is Tara. I run the Teach Without Tears TPT store, and I create resources to help teachers differentiate their lessons and meet the needs of all the students in their classroom. Over the next few weeks, we are going to be breaking down the 4 main types of differentiation by content, process, product, and classroom environment. And in this video, we are focusing on differentiation by content because that's usually the first type of differentiation you think of when you think of changing your lessons to meet the needs of your students. So when we differentiate by content, we are going to change what the students are learning. Certain students are going to be focusing more on maybe more basic concepts, while other students are focusing on more complex things. So in this video, we're going to learn 6 different ways to do this in your classroom. You might already be doing some of these things, and that's great. Maybe you'll get an idea or two for something new that you want to try. So the first way to differentiate by content is by using texts at various levels. Your students probably are all reading on different reading levels. So I taught 3rd grade for 14 years, and during that time, I had students ranging from like a level B all the way up to a level, I know I had a student at least at R at one year point, maybe even S. So on that range, there's some students who really need help with the very basics of reading, while others are comprehending several reading levels ahead of even where they are. So we need to make sure that we have texts available that are going to be able to be used by all of those students. So let me give you an example. When I taught fairy tales, I always had books at different levels to meet the needs of all of my students. So we always read the regular version of a fairy tale and then the fractured version, and then we compared and contrasted because that was one of the 3rd grade standards. So when I did that unit, I spent years collecting fairy tale books specifically for that unit, so I would have enough books to be able to differentiate and meet the needs of all of my students. You can also use the library, the school library. There are lots of places you can get books if you don't have years to invest in an entire collection. So my lowest readers read Doggerella and compared it with the regular version of Cinderella. So this was at a lower reading level so that they were able to manage the text and they were able to do the same activity, but it was differentiated by content because they were reading a different story from all the other groups. And then for my high readers, I had chapter books. So these were you choose adventures based on different fairy tales. So they would compare the regular version of Rapunzel to the story that they read in this book. So every group had a different book. They were all still practicing compare and contrast, but the content they were using was differentiated because they were each reading a different book and using the content of that book to compare and contrast. This also works if you're using a reading workshop model, which is one of the things that I love is a reading workshop model because the students spend a lot of time actually reading and engaging with texts. And I found over the years that the more time that they spent actually reading, working with the text, practicing the strategies that they were learning in their independent reading books, that really helped them improve their reading. So in reading workshop, my students would have a book box. They would get to actually choose the books that they wanted in their book box. So it's differentiated by content because they were able to choose books that they were interested in. And also the reading level was different for them. So they were able to choose books that were at their level, and then they would practice the strategies that we were learning in those independent reading books that were differentiated by content. All right, let's move on to way number 2 to differentiate by content. And that is my other favorite thing, which is guided math groups. I went from teaching whole group math lessons where I was feeling completely overwhelmed and like I was doing all the work to teaching guided math groups where my students were doing a lot of the work. And once it was planned, it was super easy for me to use from one year to the next. So guided math groups are going to be differentiated by content because even though your students are all focusing on the same lesson, you're going to be doing it differently with each of those groups based on their levels. So let's use multiplication as an example, just because in 3rd grade, that was one of our biggest units. So at the beginning of the year, at the beginning of the unit, I would give a pretest to see what my students already knew about multiplication. And it was a wide range. Just like those reading levels were a wide range, their multiplication skills also ranged from students who had never seen a multiplication problem in their life, had no strategies for being able to solve it, to those who knew what multiplication was, they could draw an array and use a picture to solve it, to those students who came in at the beginning of third grade and already knew their multiplication facts really quickly. And they definitely needed to be challenged, because when I was teaching those whole group lessons, it was pretty much a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. I was modeling the same thing for everybody. Everybody was doing the same practice problems. And at the end of the lesson, if I had a little bit of extra time and my high students finished a little bit early, I would give them some kind of enrichment to differentiate a little bit. But it really was not differentiated enough at that point, and my students were not making the progress that I wanted to see. So switching to guided math groups allowed me to meet with the students in small groups. So I had a below level group, on level group, and above level group. And then within each of those groups, I was able to tailor the lesson to exactly what they needed. So with my low students, we were basically going over exactly what multiplication is, starting to learn how to draw pictures to show multiplication problems, counting counters, using a lot of manipulatives to really help them build that basic foundation for what multiplication is. On-level group, they already had that basic understanding, so it was more practicing how to use multiplication and how to get our answers quickly after we learn all the basic strategies. And then the highest group, who came in already basically knowing their multiplication facts, we would do a lot of problem solving with multiplication, making sure that they're able to apply it to real life situations. So still the same overarching content, but within each group it was differentiated because the actual things that I was practicing with them were different. If you want more information about guided math, I did link a blog post down below. And also there's a link to the Differentiation Conversation Community. It's a place for elementary teachers to talk about all things differentiation, and guided math is one of the things that we are going to be talking about a lot over there. So head over and join. I would love to see you there. All right, third way that you can differentiate by content is using tiered activities. So kind of like guided math, your students are going to be practicing the same essential concepts, but they're going to be doing it in a little bit different of a way. They're going to get different content in each of the groups based on what they need. So I'm going to show you an example of a performance task that is for winter. It's the Do You Want to Build a Snowman performance task. And this is a tiered activity because the students are going to get different levels of activities based on where they are with the skills. So this particular performance task is going to review money. It's also going to review division, and it's going to review geometry. And based on where they are in those areas, that's going to determine which level of the performance task they get. So the lower level is going to have some lower numbers. It's going to make it a little bit easier for them to solve, but the overall concept is the same. They're going to be building a snowman. They need to decide which materials they want, and they need to figure out how much they're going to cost. They're going to figure out the total cost of their snowman, and then they're going to decide how much change they're going to get. So the numbers are just a little bit easier to work with on the level 1 task. Then it gets more challenging in the level 2, and level 3 is the enrichment. That one is going to be the most challenging. So the content is changed because they are doing different things, but again, they are still practicing overall the same skills. So you're still able to see if they understand the basics of it and can do it at their level. All right, the fourth one is interest-based groups in science and social studies. So in science and social studies, a lot of times we just keep all of our students together. They're all learning the same thing, and that's okay. In science and social studies, a lot of the time they need that same content to understand it. But in some areas, you can differentiate by content by allowing the students to bring their interests into it, and that's also really motivating for them. So let's talk about a solar system unit. If you were teaching the solar system and you wanted to differentiate by content, one thing you could do is have the students do a research project on a planet, and they are going to get to choose which planet they want to research, so that each group is researching a different planet. So the content is different. They're learning about something different. And then once they're done putting that research report together, they can present it to the class, and then the class is getting information about all of the different planets. But the student has become an expert or a specialist in that one planet that they were really interested in. We also did this in third grade with animals. We did animal reports, and the students were able to choose which animal they wanted to research. They put together a whole slideshow after they read books and did all of the background information, and then they presented it to the class, and they were the expert on that animal. So that is another way to differentiate by content within those subject areas of science and social studies. All right, number 5. This is actually the very first form of differentiation I used in my classroom. We got a new principal, and she thought that spelling lists would be a good place to start because it was something easy that we could put together in just a few minutes each week, and that where students were able to practice the spelling words at their level. So that was where I started. So what we did is we gave a pretest at the beginning of the week, actually usually on Friday, because then that gave us the weekend to put the list together. And that let us see which students from our list that came with our reading program they already knew and which ones they still needed to practice. So there were some students who couldn't spell any of the words correctly, so they would get that basic list of words. There were other students who could spell some of them correctly, so we would give them the words that they missed on the list, and then we would also add a few more challenging words, usually from the story we were reading that week. And then that high level group who already knew a majority of the words, they would actually go back into their writing and find words that they needed to practice, and then they would write those lists down. So actually, I did this 2 different ways. I started out with 3 groups, and those 3 groups each had a list. The ones that needed the words from the list itself because they didn't know any of them. The ones who missed some words but needed some more, so then we did it based on the story words. And then for my higher group, who already knew most of the words, I would choose other content words for them, maybe from science or social studies, some more challenging words for their list. And then to give the test, I would on Friday pull them in those groups, and I would give them the test that way. So that's definitely still differentiated by content. They each have their own list of words. But eventually I went a step farther even and had each student have an individualized list of words, and then the words that they needed to add to their list, they got from their writing, because that was more meaningful than just pulling words from content, because those words were ones that they would use probably on a science or social studies test, but not often in their writing. So by pulling words from their writing that they needed to practice, it then also extended into writing time as well when they were using those words and they knew how to spell them then. And at that point, when each student had an individualized list, I would pair the students and they would give each other their spelling tests for that week so that I wasn't giving one-on-one spelling tests, which would have taken forever. So that's another fairly easy way to differentiate, especially if you just start with the 3 lists at the beginning, because then you just have to pull those 3 groups for their tests each week, and it doesn't take terribly long. All right, one more way to differentiate by content. And this is another one that's pretty easy to implement if you have some technology available to you in your district. So in my district, we used Extra Math, we also used Freckle, and we used Khan Academy. Those 3 helped us to differentiate our lessons, especially Freckle, because within that program, you were able to go in, choose the specific standards that your students needed to practice, and then it would give them that standard. You would get the data on how they did on it, and each student was really practicing what they needed. So if you have access to technology, within my guided math groups, I had a technology center, and that's where my students would go on Freckle. They would practice the skills that they needed. It differentiated for them, and then I could see how they did on it. And then that data also helped me to be able to figure out exactly what my students needed in small groups within those guided math groups as well. We'll be talking more about how to use assessments to plan your differentiated instruction in a future week. All right, so those are 6 ways that you can differentiate by content within your classroom. If you would like to learn more about the other types of differentiation, make sure that you subscribe because I'm going to be sharing more of them over the next few weeks. And also make sure you check out the description because there are some links down there that you may want. I hope that you will come over and join me in the Differentiation Conversation Community because that's where lots more conversations are going to be happening about differentiation. There's actually a mini course over there already that breaks down these different types of differentiation. It has even more ideas for how you can use them in your classroom. So head over, you can access that. There are also some free resources over there, and I hope to see you there. And I will see you again next week to talk about differentiation by process.